There are places on this earth that were once well known, cities that hummed with life, markets that drew merchants from distant lands, streets where children played and scholars debated. And then, quietly, without fanfare or final ceremony, they disappeared. Not always in a day. Not always with violence or drama. Sometimes a city fades the way a name fades from memory, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you realize you haven't thought of it in years. Tonight, I'd like to take you on a journey to several such places. Cities that once appeared on every cartographer's table, that were marked with careful ink on maritime charts, that were destinations, not footnotes. And yet today, if you search for them on modern maps, you'll find nothing. Sometimes not even ruins. Just silence, and perhaps a footnote in an academic journal that few will read. This exploration is drawn from historical records, archaeological surveys, declassified documents, and the testimonies of historians who have spent decades piecing together these fragments. What follows is not speculation, but a careful examination of what we know, and perhaps, more importantly, what we've chosen to forget. If you find value in these quieter explorations, stories that require patience and reward attention, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. I also share additional research materials, historical documents, and thoughtful questions in the community tab for those who enjoy continuing the inquiry on their own. Your presence here matters, and I'm grateful for your time. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1: The City Beneath the Sand. There exists in the historical record a city that was, for centuries, considered myth. The Arabs called it Iram of the Pillars or UBAR. A place of legendary wealth, situated somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula. The ancient text spoke of it with reverence. The Quran mentions it. The tales of 1001 Nights reference it. Ptolemy marked it on his maps in the 2nd century. Medieval Arab geographers wrote of a great city that controlled the frankincense trade, that crossroads of caravans where merchants grew rich on the aromatic resin that was, in ancient times, more valuable than gold. And then it vanished. Not from memory, at least not immediately. But from the physical world. By the time European explorers began mapping the Arabian deserts in earnest, UBAR had become a story grandmothers told, a place that once was but whose location no one could quite recall. For most of the 20th century, UBAR remained in that peculiar category of places that scholars debated but could not find. Some argued it had never existed at all, that it was metaphor, a morality tale about pride and divine retribution, not an actual location. Others believed it had existed but had been swallowed by the desert sands, as countless other settlements had been. The Rub al Khali is not a forgiving landscape. It is one of the largest sand deserts in the world, a place where temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, where water is more precious than any jewel, and where the dunes shift with the patience of geological time. The turning point came in 1992. A team of archaeologists and remote sensing experts, using declassified satellite imagery from NASA, identified unusual patterns beneath the sand. Straight lines where nature rarely creates straight lines, concentrated areas that suggested human construction rather than natural formation. What they discovered, after careful excavation, was extraordinary. UBAR had indeed existed. And it had been exactly where the old stories placed it. The city was not large by modern standards, perhaps 2,000 inhabitants at its peak, but it was strategically crucial. It sat atop a massive limestone cavern that held water, that most precious resource in a waterless land. This made it the natural stopping point for caravans traveling north from Dofa, where frankincense trees grew, toward the markets of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. The city had towers, walls, homes arranged in careful patterns, wells that reached down into the cavern below. According to the archaeological evidence, UBAR thrived for perhaps 4,000 years. Generation after generation built upon the foundations their ancestors had laid. Children were born in its shadows. Merchants grew wealthy in its markets. Knowledge was exchanged. Marriages were arranged. Life happened, in all its ordinary and extraordinary ways. And then, sometime between 300 and 500 CE, the limestone cavern collapsed. The city fell into the earth. Not quickly, perhaps. The collapse may have happened in stages, a section here, a well there. But eventually, the very foundation upon which UBAR had been built betrayed it. The water that had sustained it, that had flowed through the porous rock for millennia, finally eroded the stone beyond its capacity to bear weight. What's remarkable is how quickly UBAR disappeared from human consciousness. Within a few generations, its exact location was forgotten. Caravan routes shifted. Other oases were found or developed. The frankincense trade itself declined as Christianity spread and the demand for incense in religious ceremonies diminished. By the medieval period, Arab geographers wrote of UBAR in the past tense. By the 16th century, when European mapmakers began their systematic charting of the world, UBAR simply wasn't marked. It had become apocryphal, half history, half legend, impossible to verify. And so it remained until 1992, when satellite technology revealed what the desert had hidden. This raises an important question: how many other cities suffered similar fates? How many places that were once as real as your own hometown have simply slipped from record? The answer, as we shall see, is more than we might wish to believe. Chapter 2, the port that served an empire. Let us travel now to the Red Sea coast, to what is today Eritrea, to speak of a city called ADULIS. If you are unfamiliar with this name, you are not alone. Most modern histories of the ancient world mention it only in passing, if at all. And yet, for approximately 800 years, ADULIS was one of the most important ports in the entire Indian Ocean trade network. This was the primary harbour of the Aksumite Empire, a civilization that, at its height between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, controlled trade routes connecting the Roman world with India, Arabia, and the East African interior. Aksumite ships carried ivory, gold, frankincense, and slaves northward to the Mediterranean. They returned with Roman glassware, wine, and textiles, with Indian spices and Chinese silk that had travelled the maritime routes from the South China Sea. The Aksumite kingdom was wealthy, powerful. It minted its own gold coins, which have been found as far away as India and southern Arabia. Its kings corresponded as equals with the emperors of Rome and the Shahs of Persia. When early Christianity spread from the Mediterranean, Aksum was among the first kingdoms to adopt it. Indeed, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims an unbroken Christian tradition dating to the 4th century. And ADULIS was its gateway to the world. We know what ADULIS looked like because several ancient writers described it in detail. The 6th century merchant and traveller Cosmas Indicopleustes visited ADULIS and recorded his observations. He wrote of substantial stone buildings, of warehouses filled with goods from distant lands, of a cosmopolitan population that included Aksumites, Romans, Arabs, Indians, and Egyptians. He described seeing a massive stone throne inscribed with the accomplishments of an Aksumite king. A throne that sat in the city's central plaza, visible to all who entered. Archaeological evidence confirms these descriptions. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed the foundations of churches, administrative buildings, residential districts. They found pottery from India, glass from Rome, coins from Persia. They found evidence of iron smelting, of textile production, of sophisticated hydraulic systems that brought water from distant springs. This was not a primitive outpost. This was a major urban centre, as sophisticated in its way as any Roman provincial city. The decline of ADULIS was gradual, which somehow makes it more poignant than sudden destruction. Several factors converged. The rise of Islam in the 7th century disrupted traditional trade routes, not through hostility initially, but simply through the reorganization of power and commerce across the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula. Aksumite control of southern Arabia weakened and then collapsed. Climate change, a prolonged period of decreased rainfall, may have stressed the agricultural systems that supported the urban population. By the 8th century, references to ADULIS in external sources become sparse. By the 9th century, they cease almost entirely. The Aksumite capital itself moved inland, away from the coast, seeking security in the highlands. Trade shifted to other ports. The reasons for ADULIS' abandonment are still debated by scholars. Was it environmental change, political instability, economic reorientation, or some combination of these factors? What we know is this: by the time Islamic geographers began systematically mapping the Red Sea coast in the 10th and 11th centuries, ADULIS was described as ruins. A place that once was. A memory inscribed in crumbling stone. And then, even the ruins faded from cartographic consciousness. Medieval European maps, based on classical sources, sometimes marked ADULIS on the Red Sea coast, but increasingly as a vague reference rather than a precisely known location. By the age of European maritime exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Portuguese sailors began charting the East African coast in detail, ADULIS was simply not mentioned. The location was forgotten. The name persisted only in historical texts that few read. It wasn't until the 19th century, when European archaeologists began systematically surveying ancient sites, that ADULIS was rediscovered, its ruins identified, its location confirmed. Even then, it remained obscure, known primarily to specialists. Today, if you search for ADULIS on a modern map, most will not mark it. You might find Zula, the small modern settlement nearest the ancient site. But ADULIS itself, the great port that once connected continents, exists primarily in academic papers and the memories of historians. It's worth pausing here, because this detail changes how we see everything that follows. ADULIS was not destroyed by catastrophe. It was not burned by invading armies or swallowed by earthquake. It simply became unnecessary, irrelevant to the new patterns of trade and power. And in becoming irrelevant, it became invisible. This is perhaps the most common way cities disappear, not with violence, but with silence. Chapter 3, the Twin Cities of Silk. We turn now to Central Asia, to the vast landscapes between Persia and China, to speak of a people and their cities that almost no one today remembers, the Sogdians. If you are unfamiliar with this name, you stand with the vast majority. And yet, for nearly 1,000 years, Sogdian merchants were the primary intermediaries of the Silk Road. They spoke multiple languages. They established trading colonies from the Mediterranean to China. Their cities in the Zeravshan Valley, cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and especially the twin capitals of AFRASIAB and Panjikent, were among the most prosperous and culturally sophisticated in the medieval world. The Sogdians were not empire builders in the military sense. They built their power on commerce, on cultural exchange, on their position as the essential middlemen between East and West. Sogdian merchants in Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital of China, established communities so significant that Chinese historical records detail their presence extensively. Sogdian words entered the Chinese language. Sogdian artistic motifs influenced Chinese art. And the twin cities of AFRASIAB and Panjikent represented the height of Sogdian urban culture. AFRASIAB, the older twin. AFRASIAB sits just north of what is today Samarkand in Uzbekistan. For millennia, it was Samarkand, the original settlement that predated the later medieval city. Archaeological excavations reveal a city of extraordinary sophistication. Multi-story buildings. Elaborate water management systems. Temples belonging to multiple religions, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Christianity, and local cults all coexisted. The famous AFRASIAB murals, discovered in the 1960s, show Sogdian nobles in rich garments, diplomatic embassies from distant lands, scenes of daily life rendered with artistic skill that rivals anything produced in Tang China or Byzantium. The city was wealthy. We know this from the goods found in excavations: Chinese silk, Indian gemstones, Roman glassware, Persian metalwork. AFRASIAB was a place where the world's luxuries concentrated, where cultures met and mingled. According to historical records, the city may have housed 50,000 people at its peak in the 7th century, a substantial population for that era. Panjikent, the cultural heart. Panjikent, located in what is now Tajikistan, was perhaps even more remarkable in some ways. While slightly smaller than AFRASIAB, Panjikent has provided archaeologists with an almost unprecedented window into Sogdian urban life. The city was abandoned relatively quickly in the 8th century, which meant that much of its structure remained intact beneath the accumulated earth. Excavations have revealed temples with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from Sogdian epic literature, stories we know existed but whose texts have been lost. We see heroes and demons, feasts and battles, rendered with a narrative sophistication that suggests a rich literary tradition. The residential areas show comfortable homes with multiple rooms, courtyards, storage areas. Some houses had elaborate wall paintings. One building, believed to be a palace or wealthy residence, had rooms decorated with murals showing musicians, dancers, and feasting, evidence of a class with leisure, education, and refined tastes. This was not a frontier outpost. This was a center of civilization. The Sogdian world collapsed with remarkable speed in the 8th century. The Arab conquest brought Islam eastward. The Tang dynasty of China, which had been the Sogdians' most important trading partner, weakened and then withdrew from Central Asia following a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. The Silk Road trade routes, which had made the Sogdians essential, began to fragment as political stability declined. But perhaps most critically, the Sogdians themselves were gradually absorbed into the expanding Islamic world. They converted to Islam. They adopted Arabic and Persian as languages of commerce and culture. Within a few generations, Sogdian ceased to be a meaningful identity. The people didn't disappear, their descendants still live in Central Asia, but their distinctive culture, language, and urban civilization essentially ended. AFRASIAB was abandoned in the early 8th century, possibly due to warfare, possibly due to water supply issues. A new Samarkand grew nearby, but it was a different city with different people and a different language. Panjikent was abandoned around the same time. The reasons are still debated: Arab conquest, local warfare, economic collapse, some combination of these factors. What is clear is that the city's inhabitants left, and no one returned to rebuild. Here is what makes this disappearance particularly striking: the cities that replaced the Sogdian centers kept the names, but not the locations. The new Samarkand was built near, but not on, AFRASIAB. Medieval Islamic geographers wrote extensively about Samarkand, but they described the Islamic city, not its Sogdian predecessor. AFRASIAB itself became the old city, a place of ruins used occasionally as a cemetery or a source of building stone. Panjikent was not replaced at all. A small village grew on part of the site, but the great city was simply abandoned. Medieval maps of Central Asia do not mark Panjikent. The name itself was forgotten until Russian archaeologists, working in the Soviet era, began excavations and rediscovered the site in the 1940s. Today, if you look at a map of Central Asia, you will find Samarkand, one of the great historic cities, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But you will not find AFRASIAB marked separately, even though it was a distinct city with a distinct history. And you almost certainly will not find Panjikent unless you are looking at a very detailed archaeological or tourist map. The Sogdians, who were once as important to global trade as the Dutch East India Company would later be, who built cities of sophistication and wealth, whose language and culture influenced empires, they have become a scholarly footnote, their cities largely erased from common geographical consciousness. So far, we have explored 3 cities: UBAR, ADULIS, and the Sogdian twin capitals, each of which vanished from maps despite centuries of prosperity and importance. We have seen cities swallowed by geological catastrophe, cities abandoned through economic shift, and cities whose very people cease to exist as distinct cultures. But there is another category of disappearance, perhaps more unsettling than the others. There are cities that were deliberately removed from maps. Places that were erased not by nature or economic change, but by human decision. It is to these we now turn. Chapter 4: The Closed City. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained dozens of what were called closed cities, urban areas that did not appear on official maps, whose existence was classified, whose inhabitants could not freely leave, and which outsiders could not visit without explicit government permission. One of these was known simply as Chelyabinsk 40, later renamed City 40, and eventually given the official name Ozyorsk. But for most of its existence, it had no name at all. Not on maps, not in public documents. It was a ghost city inhabited by over 80,000 people who, officially, did not exist. This was not ancient history. This was happening within living memory, within the lifetimes of many watching this now. City 40 was built for a single purpose, to produce plutonium for Soviet nuclear weapons. Construction began in 1945, immediately after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stalin was desperate for the Soviet Union to develop its own atomic weapons, to break the American monopoly. Scientists identified a location in the southern Urals with the necessary water supply from Lake Kyzyltash and relative isolation. Thousands of workers, many of them prisoners from the Gulag system, were brought to the site. They built not just a plutonium production facility, but an entire city to house the scientists, engineers, and workers who would operate it. Within a few years, City 40 had apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, theaters, shops, all the infrastructure of urban life. But this city did not exist. Maps of the region showed only forest and lakes. The nearest marked settlement was Chelyabinsk, some 70 kilometers away. If you looked at an official Soviet map, you would see nothing where City 40 stood. The inhabitants of City 40 lived in a peculiar reality. On the one hand, they enjoyed privileges unavailable to most Soviet citizens. Food supplies were better and more reliable. Housing was of higher quality. Consumer goods were more available. Salaries were higher. Education was excellent. The city needed to attract and retain highly skilled workers, so it provided incentives. But they could not leave without permission. They could not tell outsiders, including family members living elsewhere, where they lived or what they did. Letters were censored. Phone calls were monitored. The entire city was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. According to testimony from former residents, collected after the Soviet Union's collapse, the psychological toll was significant. Children grew up knowing they could not discuss their hometown with outsiders. People developed elaborate cover stories about where they lived. Some never left the city for decades. And yet, according to these same testimonies, many residents were also proud. They believed they were contributing to Soviet security, to the defense of their nation. The cognitive dissonance was profound. What makes City 40's story particularly dark is what was done to achieve its purpose. The plutonium production process generated enormous quantities of radioactive waste. Between 1949 and 1956, this waste was simply dumped directly into the nearby Teka River. Tens of thousands of people living downstream were exposed to radiation levels that, in some cases, exceeded the exposure at Chernobyl. In 1957, a storage tank containing radioactive waste exploded, the KYSHTYM disaster, the third worst nuclear accident in history. The Soviet government evacuated over 10,000 people from the contaminated zone but never publicly acknowledged the accident. For decades, Western intelligence knew something had happened but couldn't determine exactly what. And still, City 40 did not appear on maps. The existence of City 40 became public knowledge only in the late 1980s and early 1990s, during Glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Journalists began investigating. Former residents began speaking openly. Environmental scientists began documenting the catastrophic pollution of the Teka River system. The world learned that a major industrial city had operated in secret for nearly 50 years, producing the majority of Soviet plutonium while generating one of the worst environmental disasters in human history. Today, Ozyorsk appears on maps. But it remains a closed city. You still cannot visit without government permission. Much of the area around it remains contaminated and restricted. The legacy of its absence from maps continues to shape the lives of those who live there and those who were exposed to its waste. This is a different kind of disappearance from what we have discussed before. UBAR vanished because the earth swallowed it. ADULIS faded because trade routes shifted. The Sogdian cities were abandoned as their culture dissolved. But City 40 was hidden deliberately, removed from maps as a matter of policy, its existence denied even as tens of thousands lived within it. Chapter 5: The Strategic Erasure. During the 20th century, particularly during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and Western powers routinely omitted sensitive locations from publicly available maps. Military installations, nuclear facilities, secret research centers, these were either left blank or deliberately mislabeled. But there is a difference between omitting a military base and erasing an entire city. And there is an even greater difference between temporary wartime censorship and permanent removal from geographic consciousness. Let us consider several cases where cities were removed from maps not temporarily, but systematically, and where that removal had lasting consequences. The Soviet Arctic cities. Beyond City 40, the Soviet Union maintained numerous other closed cities, many in the Arctic. Places like Severomorsk, home to the Northern Fleet. Polyarny, another naval base city. Vilyuchinsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. These were substantial urban areas. Severomorsk at its peak had over 50,000 residents that simply did not appear on publicly available maps. For citizens of these cities, the situation was similar to City 40. They enjoyed certain privileges, they were essential to Soviet military power, and they officially did not exist. What makes these cases particularly notable is how long the erasure lasted. Even after the Cold War ended, some of these cities remained closed. Severomorsk, for instance, was not officially open to free visit until 1996. For 50 years, it had been a ghost, a substantial city invisible to the official geography of the world. Diego Garcia, the deported island. Not all cartographic erasures were Soviet. Diego Garcia, an atoll in the central Indian Ocean, appears on modern maps. But the story of how it came to appear reveals a different kind of disappearance. For generations, Diego Garcia was home to the Sogdians, descendants of enslaved Africans and Indian workers brought by the French in the 18th century. By the 20th century, a stable community of approximately 2,000 people lived on the atoll, making their living from fishing and coconut cultivation. In the 1960s, Britain and the United States struck a deal. The island would become a major US military base. But there was a problem: the inhabitants. Between 1968 and 1973, the entire Sogdian population was forcibly removed. They were told they were going on a trip and would return. They never did. They were deposited in Mauritius and the Seychelles with minimal compensation, where most fell into poverty. Diego Garcia was then depicted on official maps as uninhabited and developed into one of the most important US military installations in the Indian Ocean, a base used in conflicts from the Gulf War to Afghanistan. The Sogdians have fought in British and international courts for decades for the right to return. In 2019, the International Court of Justice issued a non-binding advisory opinion that the decolonization of Mauritius had not been lawfully completed and that the United Kingdom was obligated to end its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible. But the military base remains. And on most maps, Diego Garcia appears with no indication that it was ever anything other than a military facility, certainly no indication that there was a community that was erased to make that facility possible. The Sogdian homeland disappeared from maps not because the island vanished, but because its inhabitants were removed and then officially forgotten. The Chinese closed towns. China, too, has maintained restricted areas that are minimally marked on maps or deliberately obscured. The nuclear test site at Lopner in Xinjiang, the missile testing grounds in Inner Mongolia, various military research facilities, these are often either omitted from Chinese maps or marked only as vague restricted areas. More recently, concerns have been raised about the treatment of certain areas in Xinjiang, where reports suggest that some settlements have been demolished or significantly altered as part of security policies directed at the Uyghur population. Satellite imagery analyzed by researchers has documented the disappearance of religious and cultural sites, including mosques and shrines that had existed for centuries. Whether these qualify as cities removed from maps is a matter of definition and ongoing investigation. What is clear is that deliberate cartographic obscurity continues to serve strategic purposes in the 21st century. These cases raise a profound question: who has the right to determine what appears on a map? Maps are not neutral documents. They are political statements. They assert control, define boundaries, declare what is important and what can be ignored. When a government removes a city from maps, whether for military security, strategic advantage, or to erase an inconvenient population, it exercises a form of power that shapes reality itself. To not appear on a map is, in a very real sense, to not exist in the official understanding of the world. It is to be rendered invisible, dismissible, and forgettable. Chapter 6: The Cities That Vanished Twice. There is a particularly poignant category of lost cities, those that disappeared once from physical reality and then disappeared again from memory, leaving behind only the faintest traces in historical records that few now read. These are cities that were substantial, important, and then forgotten so thoroughly that even their names are uncertain, their locations debated, their very existence sometimes questioned. Let us consider a few. Muziris. The lost port of ancient India. For centuries, historians knew about a place called Muziris from ancient Greco-Roman sources. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described it as the first emporium of India. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a merchant's guide to Indian Ocean trade routes from the same era, detailed the goods available there: pepper, pearls, ivory, fine textiles, semi-precious stones. Roman merchants clearly traded extensively with Muziris. We know this because Roman coins and pottery have been found in Kerala, the region of southwestern India where Muziris was located. We know that the port connected the spice-producing regions of southern India with the Mediterranean world. We know it was wealthy, important, and cosmopolitan. And then it disappeared from the historical record. By the medieval period, Arab geographers who wrote extensively about Indian Ocean trade did not mention Muziris. The name survived in some local traditions, but its location was unknown. European colonial administrators in the 19th century, who documented countless Indian towns and historical sites, could not identify it. For most of the 20th century, Muziris existed in the same category as UBAR before 1992, possibly mythical, probably real, but essentially unverifiable. It wasn't until 2004 that archaeological excavations, guided by historical clues and the distribution pattern of Roman finds, identified the probable site of Muziris, near the modern town of Pattanam in Kerala. Excavations have since revealed evidence of extensive trade, warehouses, docks, structures that align with the ancient descriptions. But here is what's remarkable: Muziris had been forgotten so thoroughly that when the archaeological team announced their findings, most Indians, even most residents of Kerala, had never heard the name. A city that had been among the most important ports in the ancient world had vanished not just physically but from collective memory. It had disappeared twice, once from the ground, then from consciousness. Katagara, the phantom city. In the geography of Ptolemy, written in the 2nd century CE, there appears a city called Katagara. Ptolemy described it as being in the far southeast of the known world, the last major port before the unknown land. Based on his coordinates, it should be somewhere in Southeast Asia, possibly in Vietnam, possibly in southern China, possibly in Indonesia. Ptolemy indicated it was a significant trading center visited by sailors from the Indian Ocean. Medieval and Renaissance European cartographers, working from Ptolemy's text, dutifully marked Katagara on their maps of Asia. But they had no actual knowledge of what or where it was. It was a placeholder, a name inherited from ancient authority but representing no contemporary reality. Today, scholars debate whether Katagara ever existed as a specific city, or whether it was a garbled reference to several ports, or whether Ptolemy's informants had simply confused different accounts. Some identify it with Oceo in southern Vietnam, an archaeological site that reveals extensive Roman-era trade. Others suggest it referred to Chinese ports in the south. Still others think it may have been in Indonesia or Thailand. The truth is we don't know. Katagara disappeared so completely that we cannot even be certain it was a real place, though the balance of evidence suggests it probably was. This is perhaps the ultimate cartographic disappearance, a city reduced to uncertain speculation, its very existence become debatable. Port Royal, the city that sank. Some disappearances are both physical and immediate, but the memory endures in peculiar ways. Port Royal, Jamaica, was in the 17th century one of the most important English ports in the Caribbean. It was also notorious, a haven for pirates and privateers, a place of extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary vice. Contemporary accounts describe it as shockingly cosmopolitan and wealthy. Spanish silver flowed through its markets. Ships from England, France, Holland, and the American colonies crowded its harbour. Taverns and brothels did brisk business. It was called the wickedest city in the world. On June 7, 1692, an earthquake struck. The city was built on sand and silt. The seismic shock caused massive liquefaction, the ground literally turned to liquid. 2/3 of Port Royal slid into the sea within minutes. An estimated 2,000 people died immediately. Thousands more died from injuries and disease in the following weeks. Port Royal's physical location didn't become uncertain, we know exactly where it sank, and portions have been archaeologically explored by marine archaeologists. But its presence on maps became complicated. A new Port Royal was built nearby, but it was smaller, less important. The colonial capital was moved to Kingston. Within a generation, the sunken city had become more legend than memory. A moral tale about divine retribution for wickedness, a pirate's lair lost to God's wrath. Maps of Jamaica continued to mark Port Royal, but they marked the diminished successor settlement, not the great city that had sunk. The sunken city itself became a curiosity, a diving site, a subject for treasure hunters rather than a geographic reality. It had disappeared from the surface, and in disappearing, it transformed in memory from a real place with real people. Merchants and sailors and families and children, into a cautionary tale, a myth of lost pirate treasure. Chapter 7, The Pattern of Forgetting. Having explored these various disappearances, we begin to see patterns. Cities disappear from maps for diverse reasons, but there are recognizable categories. Natural catastrophe, UBAR, Port Royal, places where geology or weather simply destroyed the physical city. Economic and political shift, ADULIS, the Sogdian cities, places that became irrelevant as trade routes changed and empires rose and fell. Deliberate erasure, City 40, Diego Garcia. Places hidden or removed for strategic purposes. Complete forgetting, Muziris, Katagara, places that faded so thoroughly from memory that even their locations were lost. But beneath these categories lies something more fundamental, the fragility of memory itself. We tend to assume that important places remain known. That once a city exists and achieves significance, it will be remembered. History reveals this assumption to be naive. Geographic memory, like all memory, requires maintenance. It requires people to pass down stories, to maintain records, to care about the past. When continuity breaks, when populations are displaced, when languages change, when political systems collapse, when economic importance shifts, memory can break as well. Consider how this works. A city thrives for centuries. It appears on every map, every merchant's itinerary, every traveler's account. It is simply known as Paris or Beijing or Cairo are to us. Then something changes. Trade routes shift. A harbour silts up. A river changes course. A new power emerges with different priorities. The city's importance diminishes. The first generation remembers it as it was. The second generation knows it as ruins. The third generation knows stories about it. The fourth generation might not think about it at all. And when that fourth generation creates new maps, marks new trade routes, writes new geographies, they might not include it. Why would they? It's not relevant to their lives. It's not on their trade routes. It's not politically important. It's just old. And so it drops from the map. Not deliberately, not maliciously. Simply through the quiet logic of relevance. The map includes what matters now. The past, unless actively maintained, fades. Some disappearances are accelerated by what historians called catastrophic breaks, moments when continuity is violently disrupted. The Arab conquest of the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century represented such a break. Many cities survived, of course. Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad thrived. But others, like ADULIS, whose importance was tied to older trade patterns and political systems, faded. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century represented another catastrophic break. Cities across Central Asia and the Middle East were destroyed or depopulated. When new maps were drawn, some simply weren't reconstructed in geographic knowledge, even if they were eventually rebuilt physically. The European colonial period represented a different kind of break. Indigenous geographic knowledge was often disregarded or imperfectly transmitted. European maps became the authoritative maps, and places that didn't fit European strategic or economic interests might be overlooked, mislabeled, or forgotten. The 20th century's world wars and ideological conflicts created yet another pattern of forgetting, as we saw with the closed cities. Each of these breaks created gaps, moments when the thread of geographic memory could snap. This raises a crucial question: whose geography counts? Throughout most of human history, geographic knowledge was local. People knew their region intimately, every stream, every hill, every settlement. But their knowledge of distant places was fragmentary, based on travelers' tales and inherited wisdom. The age of systematic cartography changed this. Beginning in the early modern period, certain institutions, royal courts, military headquarters, trading companies, later national mapping agencies, claimed the authority to create definitive maps. These authoritative maps determined what was real in an official sense. A place that appeared on them existed in the official geography. A place that didn't, well, it might exist, but it didn't officially matter. This created immense power. The power to determine what counts as real. The power to shape how people understand the world. The power to include or exclude, to remember or forget. And this power has not always been exercised neutrally or benevolently. It's worth considering how many places disappeared from maps not because they ceased to exist, but because the knowledge of them was held by people whose geographic understanding was not deemed authoritative. Indigenous peoples across the world maintained sophisticated geographic knowledge, detailed mental maps of vast territories, specialized vocabularies for landscape features, oral traditions that preserved location names and historical information. When European colonial powers created their maps, much of this knowledge was ignored or imperfectly recorded. Names were changed or simplified. Significant sites were omitted because their significance wasn't understood. Entire settlement patterns might be rendered invisible because they didn't fit European concepts of what a proper city or town looked like. In Australia, for instance, Aboriginal peoples had names and deep knowledge of thousands of specific locations. Water sources, ceremonial sites, seasonal camps. Early European maps of Australia showed a largely empty continent because the mapmakers didn't recognize or value the geographic knowledge that already existed. Similar patterns occurred in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, wherever colonial cartography was imposed. These places didn't disappear in the same way UBAR or ADULIS did. They remained physically present, often continuously inhabited. But they disappeared from the maps that came to be considered authoritative. They were rendered invisible by a shift in cartographic power. This is perhaps the most common form of disappearance, not destruction or abandonment, but devaluation. A place ceases to appear on maps not because it's gone, but because the people making the maps don't consider it worth including. Chapter 8. What remains? One hopeful thread in this story is the work of archaeologists and historians who labor to recover what has been forgotten. The rediscovery of UBAR in 1992 was not luck, it was the result of decades of careful scholarship, examination of historical texts, analysis of satellite imagery, and patient excavation. Researchers refuse to accept that such an important place could simply be lost forever. Similar stories surround most of the cities we have discussed. ADULIS was identified and excavated. AFRASIAB has been extensively studied. Muziris has been found. Even Katagara, for all its uncertainty, continues to be investigated. This work matters not simply for academic reasons, though the scholarly value is significant. It matters because it restores these places to human consciousness. It allows us to remember that they existed, that real people lived real lives there, that human civilization is richer and more complex than any single era's maps suggest. We live now in an age of unprecedented cartographic technology. Satellite imagery means that virtually every square meter of Earth's surface has been photographed and is available for examination. GPS technology allows precise location marking. Geographic information systems can layer historical maps, archaeological surveys, geological data, and contemporary imagery to create multidimensional understandings of landscape. This technology has enabled discoveries that would have been impossible in previous generations. Archaeologists can now detect subtle variations in soil moisture or vegetation that indicate buried structures. They can identify ancient roads and field systems from space. They can locate lost cities that surface archaeology might never find. In theory, this means that nothing can truly be lost anymore. Everything is recorded, everything is visible, everything can be found. But this assumption, too, may be naive. Digital maps, for all their precision, are still curated by someone. Algorithms determine what appears and at what zoom level. Commercial considerations shape what is labeled and what isn't. If you use a common digital map service and search for a small historical site, you might find nothing. Not because the site isn't there, not because its location is unknown, but because the algorithm has determined it's not significant enough to display at that level of detail. This creates a new kind of invisibility, not absence from all maps, but absence from the maps that most people use. The places still exist in specialized archaeological databases and academic publications, but for practical purposes, for the average person seeking to understand the world's geography, they might as well not exist. Moreover, digital maps are typically oriented toward the present and future, not the past. They show current roads, current cities, current political boundaries. Historical layers exist, but they're optional, supplementary. The default map is always now. This means that without deliberate effort, the past recedes. Without someone actively choosing to look for historical sites, to enable historical map layers, to seek out specialized resources, the cities that have vanished remain invisible. We may have better tools than ever to prevent geographic forgetting, but we still must choose to use those tools for that purpose. There is another source of geographic memory that deserves recognition: local communities. In many cases, even when official maps lose track of a place, local people remember. Oral traditions preserve names and stories. Families pass down knowledge of where their ancestors lived. Shepherds know the old ruins on the hillside. Fishermen know the stories about the city that sank. This local knowledge is invaluable to archaeologists. When researchers go looking for lost cities, they often begin by talking to people who live in the area. What are the old names for this region? Are there stories about what used to be here? Where do people find unusual pottery shards or old coins? Local memory fills the gaps that official cartography leaves. But local memory, too, is fragile. It requires continuity of population. When communities are displaced, whether by war, economic collapse, forced relocation, or climate change, their geographic knowledge can be lost. The challenge, then, is to find ways to preserve and honor local geographic knowledge while it still exists, to integrate it into broader cartographic understanding before the threads of memory break. This brings us to an ethical question: do we have an obligation to remember? When a city disappears from maps, whether through natural disaster, economic irrelevance, or deliberate erasure, do later generations bear any responsibility to restore it to memory? One might argue, no. The past is past. What matters is the present. Maps should reflect current reality, current needs. There's no practical value in cluttering modern maps with places that no longer exist. But this view treats geography purely as utility, as tool. It ignores the fact that places are also memory, also meaning, also part of how humans understand their connection to the world and to each other. When we forget a place completely, we lose more than geographical knowledge. We lose the stories of the people who lived there. We lose understanding of historical processes, how civilizations rise and fall, how environments change, how human choices shape landscapes over time. We lose humility. When we see only the present on our maps, we can fall into the illusion that the current state of things is permanent, that our cities will always stand, that our civilization is different from all those that came before. The forgotten cities whisper a different message. Nothing lasts forever. Everything that seems permanent now will eventually fade. What seems important today may be irrelevant tomorrow. This is not a nihilistic message. It's a realistic one. And perhaps, in its realism, it's also a call to attention, to appreciate what exists while it exists, to maintain memory carefully, to recognize that the work of remembering is ongoing, never finished. We have traveled together through time and space, visiting cities that once were and are no more. Or rather, that are no more on maps, which is its own form of non-being. We have seen cities swallowed by earth and sea. Cities abandoned as trade routes shifted. Cities deliberately hidden by governments. Cities forgotten so completely that even their names became uncertain. What do these disappearances tell us? They tell us, first, that our world is more complex and layered than any single map can show. Every landscape has depth. Beneath the present surface lie previous surfaces, previous cities, previous lives. The ground we walk on has been walked on before, often by people whose names we will never know. They tell us that permanence is illusion. Every city that exists today will someday cease to exist, or will exist in such altered form as to be essentially different. The question is not whether places will change or disappear, but when and how. They tell us that power shapes reality, or at least, shapes our understanding of reality. Those who make maps exercise profound power. The choice of what to include and what to omit, what to label and what to leave blank, is never neutral. It reflects priorities, values, strategic interests. They tell us that memory is fragile and precious. The cities that vanish most completely are not necessarily those that are physically destroyed, but those that are forgotten, that lose their place in human consciousness, that cease to matter to anyone living. What, then, is our responsibility? We who live now, who draw contemporary maps, who decide what geographic knowledge to preserve and transmit, what do we owe to the past and to the future? I would suggest we owe attention. We owe the effort to remember, even when remembering serves no immediate practical purpose. We owe curiosity about what came before us. We owe humility in recognizing that our age, our cities, our concerns will someday be as remote and mysterious as UBAR or ADULIS or the Sogdian capitals are to us now. We owe preservation. This means supporting the institutions and individuals who maintain records, conduct archaeological research, collect stories, document endangered sites. It means recognizing that this work has value even when, especially when, it does not generate immediate economic return. We owe honesty. When cities are deliberately removed from maps, when populations are displaced and their geographic knowledge dismissed, when strategic interests override memory, we owe it to the forgotten to tell their stories, to acknowledge what has been erased. And perhaps we owe something else, the recognition that maps are never complete, never final, never perfect. Every map is a selection, an interpretation, a choice about what matters. The map is not the territory. The map is a conversation between past and present, between what was and what is, between memory and forgetting. In a sense, the most accurate map would be one that shows not just the present, but all the pasts, layers upon layers of human geography, cities appearing and disappearing, populations moving, landscapes transforming. Such a map would be impossibly complex, unreadable in any practical sense. But it would reflect a truth, that geography is not static but dynamic, not a fixed reality but a process, not a single story but countless stories unfolding over time. We cannot create such a complete map. But we can remember that it should exist. We can remember that beneath every place name on our current maps lie other names, other stories, other cities that once were. We can remember that the forgotten cities are not truly gone, they are still there, beneath the sand, beneath the water, beneath the new constructions. Their stones remain. Their pottery shards remain. The traces of their inhabitants remain. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells their stories, as long as someone makes the effort to mark them, even in memory, even in books, even in conversations like this, they retain a kind of presence. They remain on the map of human memory, which is perhaps the most important map of all. There is something both sad and beautiful about forgotten cities. Sad, because they represent loss of lives, of cultures, of human achievement and effort. Each vanished city held thousands or tens of thousands of individual stories, loves and fears and hopes and daily concerns, now irretrievably lost. But beautiful, too, because their very existence and subsequent disappearance reminds us of the continuity of human experience. People have always built cities. People have always believed their cities would last forever. People have always been wrong about that, and yet, knowing they were wrong, new generations have built new cities anyway. This is not foolishness. This is hope. This is the human impulse to create, to gather, to build something larger than oneself, even knowing it cannot last. The cities that vanished from maps were built by people who believed their work mattered. And they were right. It did matter. It mattered to them. It mattered to their children. It mattered for as long as it needed to matter. And now, centuries or millennia later, their cities matter again, in a different way. They matter as memory, as lesson, as connection to the vast sweep of human experience. They matter because we remember them. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the forgotten cities, through the places that maps no longer show. If you found value in this exploration, if it gave you pause to think, to wonder, to consider the layers of time and memory beneath the surface of our world, I hope you will subscribe to this channel. I create these documentary explorations for people who appreciate depth, who value patience, who believe that some questions are worth sitting with rather than rushing past. In the Community tab, I share additional research materials, historical documents, and thoughtful questions for those who wish to explore these topics further. I also welcome your own knowledge and insights. Many of you have experiences, family histories, or academic expertise that enriches these conversations. Your contributions matter. I also invite you to share this video with someone who might appreciate this kind of quiet, reflective exploration. A friend, a family member, perhaps someone who loves history or geography or simply thoughtful conversation. These longer documentaries thrive not through algorithms, but through genuine recommendations between people who value this kind of content. Thank you for your time, for your attention, and for your willingness to remember the places that others have forgotten. Until we meet again, I wish you well.